Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Jack Curley. I'm a whole being guide with Prasada, and the practices of yoga and meditation and attitude of service and learning have served me in my personal and professional life for over 50 years. At Prasada, we believe that everyone has the desire to thrive, to live a life that's healthy and has meaning. And so we work to bring you things to help you improve your feeling and sense of wellness. So today I'm going to be talking about anxiety, understanding what it is, how it gets set up in our body and in our brain. But before we jump into any of that, I always like to begin with just taking 3 deep breaths. So join me, put down whatever's in your hand if you are taking notes or drinking your coffee, and just take 3 deep breaths, breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. And now just allow your breathing to be natural. As many of you know, just this simple breathing practice can help us to calm down, help us to shift our nervous system into a more restful mode, open to learning and creativity. When the pandemic hit, I saw my own anxiety and that of others all around me, both family, friends, and extended, um, go way up, right? And I've been dealing with anxiety for my whole life. And I got really curious then about anxiety. As I said, it's been a lifelong challenge for me. And when the lockdown happened, it just seemed to have a life of its own. I actually came to believe over time that there must have been some chemical imbalance in me. And I used to say that to my wife, is that I'm just made this way. Perhaps it's genetic because there was a lot of anxiety in my family. So I spent literally years thinking that if I could figure out what's wrong with me, I could fix it. A kind of a plumbing or engineering uh, approach to it. You see, I've always been someone who likes to know how things work. When I was a kid, I figured out how my bike worked, and I used to turn it upside down and pretend I was a car mechanic and take it apart and put it back together again because I love that feeling of knowing how things work. Later in my 20s, I volunteered for an international nonprofit where I could study yoga and meditation. And I was assigned as a volunteer to the construction maintenance crew. And I learned how to be a plumber and a plumbing mechanic. And I was fascinated to learn how these things work. And I really enjoyed it for a long time. And that rolled into going back to university to get a degree in engineering. And then I had a 20-year career in civil engineering, all of it based on how things work and my love for how things work. And welcome to everyone who's just joining. You haven't missed much. I'm just introducing it. You might want to pause and take a couple deep breaths. So, as I said, when COVID hit and we were all locked down, I was really motivated to learn something about anxiety. How does this work? And that's when I discovered a man named Dr. Judson Brewer from Brown University on YouTube. And he was giving daily lessons of about 10 minutes on what anxiety was and how to manage it. And I was so taken by this scientific approach to it. He's a addiction psychiatrist and a neuroscience research, and he specializes in helping people to change habits. So I I bought his book, and I was so moved by his book that I signed up for a training with Dr. Brewer, a 6-month training. So I'll be quoting that book a bit today. So I want to say that up front so that I don't have to say it each time I quote him. The first thing I learned from Dr. Brewer is how the brain works. And this is the first thing he teaches, is understanding how anxiety gets set up, how it becomes a habit, and how it becomes a repeating reactive behavior. So that really appealed to my engineering brain. How things work, how the brain works, how does anxiety get set up? And as someone who always liked to learn how things work, I really dove into this. So read the book, got a lot out of it. And what we're going to cover today is that part, is how our brains work and how anxiety is a product of our brain. So we'll be diving into just a wee bit of neuroscience and psychology to better understand how our brain works and how anxiety becomes a habit. Anxiety. It can range from a bit of nervousness before a test or a presentation at work or elsewhere, to full-blown panic attacks, and even bring about physical symptoms like irritable bowel syndrome, reflux disease, digestive issues, cardiovascular, respiratory issues, social problems, and on and on. We all know what anxiety is. So let's define anxiety. So the dictionary definition of anxiety is a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Now, if you think about that, uncertain outcome, that can be almost anything. You might overhear in the coffee room someone saying, oh, business is down this quarter, and you might begin to think, oh, maybe there's going to be layoffs, and cue the anxiety. Some people wake up with anxiety and then just attach it to whatever happens. You might hear a strange noise in your car and start to trip out thinking, wow, is this going to be expensive? Is my car going to last? So pause for a moment and see if this rings any bells for you. Is there anything that you notice that even just hearing about it can prompt anxiety in you? And if you'd like to share it in the chat for all of us to learn and understand that anxiety is a common problem for all of us, please feel free to put that in the chat. So anxiety, a feeling. That's the key word here. It's a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease. It happens in the body and it happens in the mind. It's a strange thing, anxiety. It can be difficult to see it clearly, even though we feel it. It lives internally. It's a mental and physical event, but it's not as clear to us as a skin rash or a bruise. It's in our habits. So think about how some people respond to excessive stress with alcohol, a glass of wine, or doing something, right? Try and make that feeling go away. So some of the typical symptoms of anxiety are edginess, restlessness, tiring easily, impaired concentration, irritability, increased muscle aches, difficulty sleeping, digestion problems, procrastination, loss of focus, so much more. It underlies so many different things that that affect our ability to perform. It can pop up when we're paying the bills or dealing with personal finances. It can come up in social situations. I mean, why do first dates so often happen in bars and nightclubs? The nervousness of that moment might prompt us to have a double rather than our usual drink, right? It happens in work situations, especially in meetings and in presentations. It can show up in just about everywhere and in everything. And it can create other bad habits like eating junk food to make us feel better, drinking too much coffee, strangely enough, or alcohol, smoking cigarettes, etc. Or like me, you can get caught up and addicted to thinking that if I can just figure out why I'm anxious, I'll be able to fix it. So we get anxious, and we all know what it feels like, and we know it when we see it. Yet how we deal with it is critical. And the way we have to deal with it is, first of all, we have to know how and why anxiety gets set up. Otherwise, we continue to get caught up in it. And we have these distractions to help us on short-term fixes. Okay, you know, I can have a glass of wine, I'll feel better, but the underlying cause of the anxiety is still there. And so what we need to understand is that anxiety actually grows out of our most basic survival mechanisms. It becomes a self-perpetuating habit. So Dr. Brewer has created this amazing framework to change our relationship to anxiety so that it unwinds on its own. And the first thing that Dr. Judd teaches is how our brains work. So that's where we're going right now. So to understand how anxiety occurs, here's how our brain operates. The brain can be divided into two brains. We have the old survival brain and the new thinking, planning brain. Working together, these two functional areas in the brain help us to survive, to plan, and become skillful in life. However, if they get out of balance with each other, we can spin out into anxiety and worry. Let me explain. So the older brain, the survival brain, is the oldest part of our brain, and it is that which allowed us to survive as a species. This part of our brain primarily responds to threats in the environment, and when fear arises, compels us to act to survive. So think of our ancient relative Og seeing a saber-toothed tiger. He feels that he might become that tiger's dinner, and he hides or flees. And if he needs to, he'll fight. But mostly we want to avoid anything that's going to make us dinner for something else. Another more modern example would be, let's say you're walking down the street and you're staring at your phone, checking last night's Phillies score or whatever, and you step off the curb, and out of the corner of your eye, you see a speeding car coming at you. And instantly you step back onto the curb, right? It's unconscious. We don't think about it. We have this immediate reaction. This adrenaline and cortisol flood our body and give us this ability to jump back without any thought involved. Because if we had to think about it, oh, maybe I should jump back onto the curb right now, we're probably too late. So fear is an adaptive mechanism, and it's the oldest survival mechanism we have. Fear teaches us to avoid dangerous situations like this in the future. From a psychiatric perspective, Dr. Judd taught that anxiety and panic come from fear. But from a neuroscience perspective, the main evolutionary function of fear is to help us survive. So it's that instantaneous response. And so when we have that fear, we learn through what's known as negative reinforcement. Whoa, that was close. So the trigger was we stepped into traffic, we saw the speeding car, our behavior, we jumped back instantly. And the result, the reward for that is we have this fear of dying and this adrenaline rush. So Dr. Judd says the unpleasantness of this fearful physiological reaction helps you to learn. Put your phone away and look both ways before crossing the street. So it's the shock of it that teaches us, the fear of it. It's an autonomic nervous system reaction, that fight, flight, or freeze. Cortisol and adrenaline are meant to help us act that quickly. Way faster than our newer brain, which I'll get to in a sec. After our brain processes this afterwards, after we jump back on the curb, our brain starts to process this and creates new learning and a new habit. Look before you leap. So anxiety and panic are both formed from fear, but fear is not the sole culprit in creating anxiety. As we saw, fear is adaptive. It helps us survive. Anxiety is maladaptive. Our thinking and planning brain can spin out of control when it doesn't have enough information. And that's our new thinking, planning brain. So let's look at that. In the last 1.5 million years or so, our species, developed a new part of our brain. That part of our brain helps us to be creative. to think, to plan for the future. Neuroscientists call this area of the brain the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC. And its job is to predict what will happen in the future based on our past experience. So if you come to a curb again and you look out the street and you see a bus instead of a car, your brain can say, well, that's pretty much a car, just bigger, and we don't step out into the street, right? So our brain learns from the past and preserves us in the present moment. So it uses past experience and information to inform future actions. So then here's what that looks like. Trigger, we come to a busy street crossing. That triggers the memory from the other time. We look up from our phone and we look both ways and we cross the street unscathed and live to search our Instagram feed once again. This is positive reinforcement. We did a behavior that resulted in a good thing. And so now we've learned how to put down our phone and cross the street safely. And so this is how habits are set up. We either have a negatively reinforced habit or a positively reinforced habit. So as I said, this new brain, the PFC, uses data from our past experiences to plan for the next time we come to a busy intersection. It has a job to do, and it does it relentlessly. For example, if you're driving in your car and you hear a strange noise in your car, you begin to wonder, is something wrong? And if you don't know how your car works, your PFC, whose job it is to predict the future, begins to spin out possibilities for you. Maybe I just need an oil change. And then, because we don't have enough information and say, oh yeah, that's it, I need it, we don't know, it goes on. It keeps going. Oh, wow, the brakes could fail. Oh man, how much is that going to cost? That could be hundreds, that could be thousands. Oh man, and I'm taking vacation next week. This is happening at the worst time. So there you have it. Funny how that PFC, when it's provoked with a little bit of fear, can end up very quickly at worst case scenarios. And this is the key point in understanding where anxiety comes from. The PFC, the prefrontal cortex, this thinking, planning brain, needs information. And if information is lacking, the PFC continues to play out different versions of what might happen, running all these simulations based on similar information. And if you think about it, that's what happens when we're anxious. And we've all experienced this. It sometimes maybe just in the background, but our brain is running through all these possibilities. So anxiety is born when our PFC, stimulated by fear, doesn't have enough information to accurately predict the future. The fear that triggered us to begin to try and predict what's going to happen gets bigger. And guess what? It takes over. Now the old survival brain is dominant, and the new brain, the PFC, goes offline. There is uncertainty, and that is the key here. The PFC is looking for certainty, and when it doesn't find it, when it's confronted with uncertainty, combined with that fear, we end up with anxiety. So I'm going to read a quote to you right from Dr. Brewer's book, because I couldn't say it better myself. So he says, when fear-based learning is paired with uncertainty, your well-intentioned PFC doesn't wait for the rest of the ingredients, that is, more information. Instead, it takes whatever it's got in the moment, uses worry to whip it together, fires up the adrenaline oven, and bakes you a loaf of bread you didn't ask for, a big hot loaf of anxiety. And in the process of making the loaf, your brain stores a bit of the dough, like sourdough starter, puts it away for later. the next time you plan for something, your brain pulls out that starter out of your mental pantry and adds it as an essential ingredient to the mix, to the point where the sour taste overpowers reason, patience, and the process of gathering more information. So the PFC screams for information, and fear is what's prompting it to do that. So then anxiety gets set up as a habit that will spring up whenever information is lacking. Our thinking and planning brain, this new brain, does not have an automatic sleep mode when it runs low on info. On the contrary, it screams out, "Go get me some information." And in these modern times, with 24/7 availability of information, we head off to Google and we get a gazillion answers. So this morning, I Googled getting a handle on anxiety, and I got 205 million results. So now we have all of this information. But why do we still have anxiety and even more anxiety? Well, because with 205 million replies to your simple 5 or 6 word query, there's oodles and oodles of contradictory, maybe even purposely misleading information. Contradiction, think about it, is the height of uncertainty. This is only going to increase as techniques for manipulating information increase. And this is why in today's world, after the pandemic, during the pandemic, anxiety has been going through the roof. The less certain the info, the more our PFC spins out and fight flight takes over, which consequently shuts down the PFC. That fear now is dominant. It leads to anxiety, which leads to worry, which strangely enough is a mental behavior. So when your brain is calling out, do something, I need information, we worry because your brain can't make the difference between doing this or that. You're doing something, you're worrying. Worrying is a mental behavior in response to feeling anxious. So what can we do? Many of us try to suppress or think ourselves out of anxiety, like I've done for years. Like I said, if I could only figure out what's wrong with me, I could fix it. Unfortunately, both willpower and reasoning rely on that PFC, which at these critical moments, without enough information, shuts down. It isn't available. We're now in the throes of anxiety and worry. So what can we do? So the first step is knowing how our brain works, understanding that it's uncertainty that is weakening our brain's ability to deal with the stress and is priming us for anxiety when fear hits. So we can be on the lookout. So we can notice, we can become aware when we get anxious. We can begin to recognize in real time, hey, our survival brain is in high gear and my thinking planning brain doesn't have enough information. There's too much uncertainty and it's just doing its level best to try and explain to us, me, you, what to do. And what could happen more than that. And those things can go quickly down the road of worst case scenarios. We can become curious. We can begin to say to ourselves, I wonder what I'm so uncertain about. Now, first of all, you have to come to that point where you say, well, I'm anxious. You have to pause, right? And you say, I'm anxious. And realizing now with this knowledge of how our brain works, okay, the part of my brain that I really need right now is not available for some period of time. So we can pause and we can ask ourselves, what am I uncertain about? Once we do that, once we become aware, okay, I've got this uncertainty. I don't know what's going to happen. My brain is telling me all these different things. I've got the fight or flight going. Remember how we learn. We learn from negative and positive reinforcement. So leveraging these learning mechanisms that lead to worry and anxiety in the first place, we can hack our brains and break the anxiety cycle. We become aware that we are getting anxious or panicking, and then we look at what results from anxiety and panicking. Once we're aware, you see, habits are set up by the reward. We do something, something triggers us, we do something in response, we get a result from that. If it's a good response, if we like the way it feels, we do it again. If it's a bad response and we don't like the way it feels, we're not going to do it again. Strangely enough, anxiety is something we don't like to feel, but we do it again and again. And that's because we don't know a way out of it. So once we're aware of how unrewarding anxiety is, say, wow, this is my response every time I pick up my monthly bills. What am I uncertain about? Well, maybe I'm uncertain about my money flow, my cash flow. Okay, is it real or is it not? Is it just a habitual worrying about money, or do I have to do something here? So once we become aware of how unrewarding anxiety is, we can then bring in a bigger, better offer. We can see, okay, I'm anxious. I can see myself spinning out into anxiety. And since our brains will choose, so our brain's going to do the heavy lifting and help us to undo anxiety. Our brains will choose more rewarding behavior simply because they feel better. We can practice replacing old habitual behaviors such as worry with those that are more rewarding. So at times, when you find your mind is starting to spin out in your worry du jour, and they are endless, you can pause. You can take a deep breath. You can just recognize I'm anxious. And you can wait for that rational part of the brain, this new thinking, planning brain, to come back online as you calm down. And once it's up and running again, you can then compare the feeling of anxiety to that of the calmness and clarity that you get from pausing and breathing. And to our brains, then, it's a no-brainer. We can choose, the brain will choose whatever feels best. And since this pausing and recognizing and calming is a much better reward than endless worry, our brain gradually, over time, and it doesn't take too long a time to break that habit, our brain chooses this bigger, better offer of pausing in the moment. So that's basically how anxiety gets set up. And how it happens in your own life is what is important to recognize. And that's why we offer a 30-day training in anxiety, unwinding anxiety, which was created by Dr. Brewer. And we use the tools created by Dr. Brewer to do that. If you'd like to know more about Dr. Brewer's Unwinding Anxiety, I'm going to put a link to his book and app on Amazon in the chat. And if you're interested in a 30-day training using Dr. Brewer's app, he designed a wonderful app to do this called Unwinding Anxiety. He also has one for binge eating called Eat Right Now. It's worked for cigarette smokers, and he has a new one coming out for people who have depression. Have a look. And if you have any questions, you can email me at jack@prasadawholebeing.com. If you're interested in our workshop, please let me know. We like to get about 10 people, and then we have weekly meetings where we get together and learn from each other about how we are working with this method. and it's been really helpful. I have an ongoing group on Thursday night right now, and I have to say that I've learned as much from this getting together and getting connected around this topic as anyone joining it. So thank you very much for being here today. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Have a great day. See you soon and be well.